Sure, let's do it. Okay, welcome to the event, everybody. Today's event is titled Elevating Unheard Voices, Diversity of Content in Children's Books and Beyond. And this is meant to be a complementary event to our earlier MBPR event, which was about diversity and staffing. Now we're talking about the same theme with regard to book content. I'm Arnold Ringstad on the MBPR board, and I'll be hosting today. Very much special thanks to MBPR board members Kelly Hultgren and Melissa York for putting this event together with me. Please be aware the event is being recorded. The recording will be available in the member section of the website afterwards. And just be aware the chat is being recorded as well. And one more announcement, the member drive is now closed. Special thanks to MBPR members Mari Kesselring and Allison Judah for coordinating that. So without further ado, let's introduce you to today's wonderful panelists. So 3 panelists today for our event. First, we have Duchess Harris. So Duchess Harris, JD, PhD, is a professor of American Studies and Political Science at Macalester College. She is the author of 3 academic books, including Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Trump. She's also the proud curator of 123 books for 4th through 12th graders in the Duchess Harris Collection for ABDO Books. Her newest edition of the collection, Justice for George Floyd, will be available January 2021. She resides in Vadnais Heights with her husband of 25 years, daughter, 2 sons, dog, and 2 cats. Welcome, Duchess. Next up, we have Tasha Nins. Tasha Nins is a middle grade children's librarian at the Maplewood branch of the Ramsey County Library. She has previously worked for the St. Paul Public Library and Hennepin County Library. Tasha is a 2017 graduate of the St. Catherine University Master of Library and Information Science program and a member of the 2017 cohorts of the American Library Association's Emerging Leaders Program. Welcome, Tasha.
Yeah.
And our third panelist, KT Horning, is the director of the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A former children's librarian, she is the author of several books on literature for children, including From Cover to Cover, Evaluating and Reviewing Children's Books, and has served as the president of the ALA's Association for Library Service for Children and United States Board on Books for Young People. KT received the Scholastic Library Publishing Award from the American Library Association in 2009 for her outstanding leadership in the field of librarianship and children's and young adult literature. Welcome, KT. Okay, so let's start off at a broad level with the panel. I'd like to hear from all 3 panelists on this kind of very basic question. Are there gaps in the content you're seeing out there that you'd personally like to see filled? Are there topics that you feel are maybe oversaturated or ineffective? Let's start with Duchess on that first question.
Okay, great. I definitely think that there are gaps, and the way that I identify what the gaps are by teaching undergraduates. And when they show up into my classroom, I often find the information that they are missing for my area of expertise is really the contribution of African Americans around the World War II period, and also in earlier time periods. Reconstruction seems to be something that is not covered in K-12 curriculum.
And then Natasha, what about you? Any particular thoughts on gaps in content that you've noticed?
Yeah, I agree with Duchess. Also, there is a huge gap still, despite all the attention that's being paid to it on own voices content. And that can get really frustrating, especially like I work with middle grade students. They come in and they'll be looking for books about personal heroes that they have that are Black or other people of color. And they don't really want the same ones that have been churned out by the same white authors all the time. They want to hear from their own community, about the heroes that they have been told about growing up in their own houses. And a lot of times the books that they see are like, they're okay, they do the job, but there isn't that love that's poured into it that you can see when it's a Black author writing like a Black hero. So thanks, Duchess, for your books. So that's for sure is one. Yeah.
Interesting. And then KT, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with what both Duchess and Tasha said. At the Cooperative Children's Book Center, we serve librarians and teachers, K-12 teachers all over Wisconsin and sometimes beyond. And just the kinds of questions we get asked when they're looking for particular books There are subjects that come up over and over again, such as own voices books, as you mentioned, any authentic literature. They also kind of, the best way to describe it would be diversity within diversity. We tend to see the same types of books that are about, for example, African-American people. They will either be set during the civil rights era or during the slavery era, or if they are contemporary, they're usually more urban stories, kind of gritty urban stories. And what we'd really love to see is just more, different kinds of genre writing. And this would be across the board for all BIPOC writers and books. And a big gap we have in Wisconsin that I know you have in Minnesota as well is one of the hardest requests to fill are books about Hmong people. Because I think because of the settlement patterns, the big publishers in New York just have never heard of Hmong people for the most part. And it's a huge, huge part of our population in Wisconsin. And it is really hard to find things. And most of the things that are out there are done by small publishers. Then the last one, I just got a request today that was really hard, if not impossible to fill, from a teacher who was looking for books for first graders about the benefits of being bilingual. And there just is nothing that we could find. I even consulted with my colleagues, and there are bilingual books for children, not nearly enough. But when it comes down to like a story about a child who is bilingual and it's positive instead of being, more of a negative thing, like what they can't do, there's very little. So those are the things that come to mind right off the top of my head.
So Katie, I think that segues pretty well into another question I have for you, and that's about trends that you're seeing in representation and sort of the data that we have. I believe you have some slides on this, kind of showing this sort of progress, how far we've come, how far we have to go. If you want to pull those up and kind of talk a little bit.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great.
Okay, does everyone can see that?
Let's see, it's not showing up here.
No, let's see. Sorry. Let me try that again. Sorry about that.
Right.
When we practiced this, it went perfectly, of course. Share screen. Okay, that should do it.
There we go.
Okay. All right, let's start with this one. And this is an image I think is probably familiar to a lot of people. It is an image that was actually created by Sarah Park-Dolan and David Hook. And they also had done one in 2017, but it uses the statistics that the CCBC has collected for many years and puts it in a graphic format. And it's quite a well-known image. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background as to where this came from, what led to this. We've been collecting statistics at the CCBC on diversity representation in children's books. We started in 1985, just with looking at books by Black authors and artists. And in 1985, there were just 18 books. The following year, there were 18 as well. We just decided to start documenting these numbers. And so the very first graphic image that we know of that was done based on our statistics was in 1989. And this appeared in USA Today. And it's just a very typical USA Today graph that visualizes the number. And this was out of about 3,000 books total that were published for children around that time. And then we've continued tracking. When you just look at books from Black illustrators and authors from 1985 to 1993, you can see there's a small trajectory. Well, it goes from 18 up to almost 100, a little over 90. But what we saw then was just kind of a leveling off. Instead of the line going up and up and up, it started to plateau. And this particular graph shows we started getting requests for other kinds of diversity represented in books. So we started keeping track of BIPOC books. And we also started breaking it down into by and about. And one thing you can see, the dotted lines are the about books. And if you're looking just at the African-American line, which is orange, you can see if you follow this orange line, solid orange line, how you see that same trajectory I showed you early, and then you see the plateauing that goes from about 1992 on to 2014. But what you see then when you look above it at the dotted line that represents the number of books about that are not necessarily, in fact, the majority of them are not being written by Black authors and illustrators. You can see from the gap between the two how many books there were and still are by non-owned voices, by people who are not themselves Black or African American. And then the other lines, you see the various colors for American Indian, Asian American, Latinx, both the dotted lines and the solid lines. And they all are just kind of flatlined there, except for Native Americans, which just has kind of run along the bottom. And then when we look at books that we've received, we started to see a real change in about 2014. And you can see 2014 here, how the line just has been going up, both the by line, which is red here, and the about line, which is still higher than the by line. And what happened in 2014 was the establishment of We Need Diverse Books. So we actually just made this graph. I think you're among the first people to see it because we wanted to see, we had kind of a sense that We Need Diverse Books had a huge impact on publishing. And indeed, this graph does seem to indicate that it has made a real difference. And then we often hear from white authors and illustrators how hard it is for them to get published. We made this graph just showing the numbers in 2018 and 2019, where we've added the white authors and illustrators, and it makes it really visible how they really are overrepresented in books for children and teens still in 2019, which is the most recent year we have the statistics for. We've also in 2018 added Arab and Arab Americans. We're getting a lot of requests for books on those topics. And then we realized, actually it was a grad student at St. Catherine's who wrote us recently and said, you know, why do you have Asian and Pacific Islander in the same category? They're not at all the same. And she sent us a very helpful article. We had just been following what the ALA used for their Asian Pacific Islander group and award. And so we did indeed then decide to go back and separate those out. And you can see it's a very small number of books by and about Pacific Islanders. So those are just some visual examples of where we've been and where we are. We are seeing some signs of progress, but we still need to see more. We hope to see more.
Interesting. Thank you very much. That's really, really interesting to see those numbers like that. It seems like there is, like you say, some progress, if a long way to go in producing these books. But Tasha, I wonder, in your experience, about the process of getting those books into the hands of readers. How does it work at your library? How does library choose which books to add to the collection, and is diversity and representation a factor? And what kind of demand are you seeing from library patrons on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so currently I order all of the juvenile ebooks for Ramsey County libraries. That doesn't include St. Paul, separate system. Used to work there too, but and So definitely like diversity is a factor in collecting books. It has been just like my whole life. It's not something that I had to like adjust to as a professional. So that is one thing that, I mean, I don't want to say I bring to the profession because it should have been here. But there is definitely, in the past few years, there has been that realization that like, oh, like, right, maybe we should get more diverse books, which is, you know, not great that it took that long. But yes, it currently is part of the reporting process within Ramsey County to disclose how many books are like quote unquote diverse, but that's a very loose term that I don't super love. So I also report my own numbers. I report how many are our own voices, how many are in different languages, and keep track of how many are also coming from people from different types of communities, like the disability community. Trying to make sure that it's not just what's on the New York Times bestseller list, because whatever, I have opinions about those anyways. But making sure that the books that we are collecting are what our community wants and needs, and not just the parents. Like, I'll be honest, I don't like love adults. So it's not that I don't value their opinions all the time, but I'm a children's librarian. I purchase for children. I, also talk to teachers when March hit and everything went online. Had to do a deep dive with the teachers in my school district and the Minnesota Department of Ed to kind of align all those like teaching quotas and things like that to what we have in the collection, what we don't have. So filling in a lot of that nonfiction has also been difficult because there's so much out there, kind of, again, just, it's very whitewashed, nonfiction especially. And if you go and look for some of the different types of like quote unquote diversity in children's nonfiction, especially when it comes to Black Americans, so much of it is just like trauma porn and so much slavery. And like, there's other stories to be told. Like George Washington Carver, also great dude, but like there's 50,000 books on him. Like, looking at some of what Duchess has produced and what other authors are producing that focus more on recent history and recent-ish in terms of like, again, like Reconstruction era forward. There are challenges that have happened and there are heroes that come out of those challenges, and focusing also on them and highlighting those histories that have kind of been hidden, for whatever reason, and bringing those to the forefront. It's so exciting when a kid comes in and they're like, I have to do a report on someone, so like, hey, do you have anyone like Black that would be cool to write about that's not George Washington Carver or Harriet Tubman? Like, they're both great. I love having these conversations with kids because they'll be like, I kind of want to do the same thing that everyone else is doing. So when you can go back in the stacks and you can say, hey, here's the Tuskegee Airmen, here's Ruby Bridges, like pull in those different people that they might not have heard of, or pull in some of the more contemporary civil rights leaders. That's always fantastic to do. And those are things that I'm constantly searching for in my purchasing. I also work a lot with the librarian that purchases the physical, well, there's two of them, the physical books for the library. We check in on each other. We write each other emails like, hey, you better have ordered this, to make sure that we also keep each other accountable because we all have blind spots. So yeah, hope that answered the question.
Sure, that was great, thank you. And that's a good kind of transition into, you mentioned Duchess's books, which is a great transition into Duchess's work. Duchess, can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in publishing for kids and kind of, you touched on before your academic work and kind of how that informed your knowledge of what kind of gaps kids coming in had. So how did you kind of get involved in this and how did that all start? I think you're on mute, Duchess.
There we go. My apologies for being muted. Yes, I said, well, how did I get into publishing children's books? I'm going to embarrass you, Arnold, because no one else on the call realizes that you discovered me. So that is how I got into this. Arnold found me in 2015 to be a content consultant for a book that ABDO Publishing was doing. And the rest is history. So here I am. I find when I am teaching that people do not know this subject matter, and it's because of what Tasha and KT have explained, that I get students who've just finished high school, and if this material isn't available K through 12, then they show up to my class not having been exposed to it. What are the implications of that? Just to make it concrete, I tell my math colleagues that no one comes to their class not having had pre-calculus. You don't get into certain institutions if you haven't had that level of training in math. And so the point of departure is that everyone has had at least algebra, advanced algebra, pre-calculus, and probably calculus to get accepted into most colleges. To get into the finest institutions in the nation, you can get an acceptance letter and not know any of this material. So that is partly how we got Freedom's Promise launched. Freedom's Promise is a division of my imprint. I have something called the Duchess Harris Collection, which includes works that are divided for 6th to 12th graders and 4th to 8th graders. Freedom's Promise is a division within the 4th to 8th graders to look at topics around racial issues that probably have not been addressed. And so this speaks to what Tasha's saying. You're not going to find the George Washington Carver book in this collection. So in our first set, there's a book on Barbara Jordan. A lot of people are not familiar that she was a member of Congress from Texas. There's a book on Blacks in Paris, which is about the expatriate experience that once African Americans served in World War I and went to Europe and realized how well they were treated by the French, there was an exodus between World War I and the Civil Rights Movement, where African Americans left the United States because they were experiencing so much discrimination and ended up having a life over there where they felt comfortable celebrating their art, their music, and different aspects of Black culture. Then I have a book on Daisy Bates and the Little Rock Nine, which are the group of high school students that were desegregating Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. The Grand Contraband Camp is a subject matter that most adults are not familiar with. This is the area in the state of Virginia that is based on where the 1619 Project was, where Black people were originally dropped off in Virginia. A huge population of people were enslaved during the Civil War. Contraband is property of war. When the North won a battle, they ended up taking the property of the Southerners and then freeing them. And so this was a camp where free Black people were able to live free before the Civil War was actually over. Hidden Heroes is based on the narrative of Black women who were mathematicians at NASA. I was familiar with that story because my grandmother was actually one of them. I have a book on the March on Washington. I have a book on Oni Judge, and Oni Judge actually was enslaved by George Washington when he was in the White House, and the first White House was in Philadelphia. She had previously been enslaved by him in Virginia. When she got to Philadelphia, she saw something she'd never seen before called free Blacks. And so she was escaped and she was never caught. A book on Ruby Bridges, the Scottsboro Boys, and then the Black National Anthem book is about the fact that the song Lift Every Voice and Sing is actually the Negro National Anthem. Some people have heard the hymn in their church, but not known that that's what it was. In set 2, I include the birth of hip hop, something fun, something more contemporary. I also have the significance of Booker T. Washington, who has written about some, but not as much as some other leaders from the 19th century. Kara Mosley Braun, who was the first Black woman in the Senate. People are talking a lot now about Vice President-elect Kamala Harris because she's currently in the Senate, but Kara Mosley Braun was the first Black woman to do that. Fannie Lou Hamer from Mississippi, who was a part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was pivotal in the 1860s, was helping Black people transition from slavery to freedom. Harriet Robinson Scott, I was inspired to write about her because if you're a Minnesotan, you know that Dred Scott spent some time at Fort Snelling, but no one writes about his wife. Also, Ida B. Wells, the court case Loving versus Virginia, which happened in 1967, which made it legal for interracial marriage. Then, of course, the novelist Richard Wright, and then a book on the significance of the 13th Amendment and what its legacy was. The purpose of that book is to talk about how the 13th Amendment actually made African Americans citizens, but the caveat in there is that you were only free if you were not incarcerated. So it's also a way to talk about the prison industrial complex. And finally, in the third set, I have a fun book about Aretha Franklin that came out before she passed away. We have a book on the impact of Black churches and how churches have functioned as a political site as much as a religious site in African American culture. The Calvin Spann book was inspired by someone that I went to college with. This is her dad, and he was a Tuskegee Airman. So instead of talking about all the Tuskegee Airmen, it focuses on him. I move out of the Black-white paradigm, have a book on the Chinese Exclusion Act, have a book on the American Indian movement leaders, Dennis Banks and Russell Means. Also a book on the Indian Removal Act, and then a book about Japanese American imprisonment and internment. I also have a book on the Chinese American woman politician in California, March Fong Yu. And then I have books on John Lewis and the Negro Leagues in baseball. And so all of those things are, my attempt at trying to, provide some diversity to the profession.
Great, thanks, Duchess. And I got to say, as someone who worked on some of those books with editing, things like that, they're wonderful books. And I learned a ton just working on this editing and photo research. So really, really valuable resources for sure. Turning back to KT, so you talked about how the CCBC documents diversity in children's books. Do you find that this affects publisher decisions? Does CCBC promote its findings? And do you get the sense that publishers are listening to these kinds of facts and figures? Oh, I think you're muted still.
To some extent, I think they do. They're definitely aware of the statistics we keep. I think in those early years when I was showing you the trajectory of books by Black authors, we know that was in large part response to us documenting and pointing out that there were only 18 books. So we often have, and I'm talking in particular about the large trade publishers. They will often specifically talk to us about something, or it always kind of amuses me when we once had a call from a large trade publisher asking if we could help them find what they called a Hispanic artist. And I said, you're calling Madison, Wisconsin from New York City with that question? Look out your window. But we do think it has some impact, but I really think the grassroots organization of We Need Diverse Books has really had a tremendous impact. And one reason I think they are so successful is that they're so savvy at using social media. And they have there used to, every once in a while, there'd be a big story in a newspaper about our statistics. And we saw that happen about every 5 years. And it might be, for example, the New York Times or the Atlanta newspaper. And then all of this, we'd have this little ripple effect, and we'd get all these questions from newspapers around the country on that, and then it would die down. So it'd be a buzz for a while. But what happened with We Need Diverse Books is that, and that group was formed around the same time that Walter Dean Myers and Christopher Myers wrote editorials in the New York Times that were extremely, had a big impact about the lack of books about, by and about Black people. And so those two things happen at the same time. And then we probably get on average 2 to 3 calls or emails a week from the press and from people in higher education doing research. And they just have never let up since 2014. And I think it's due largely to We Need Diverse Books just keeping things in front of people all the time through social media. And there is a really, really rich discussion on social media about children's books, and particularly the ones that have not been good, where you may have all of the trade journals give books starred reviews, and then Edie Campbell, for example, will post something on Twitter about, wait a minute, I've read this book and I can't believe it's getting starred reviews for these reasons. And then there'll be a discussion about the book that is generally, I think, extremely enlightening. And it's the type of critical response we should get on a regular basis, but it is mostly happening, it seems, on social media.
Interesting. Just a reminder for attendees, we do have a Q&A portion scheduled for later on, so do feel free to plug in some questions into that Q&A box in Zoom if you have anything comes to mind during the presentation. Turning back over to Tasha, I'm curious about how books get into readers' hands on the front lines at the library. You mentioned them coming to you saying, I have a book report I need to do, help me find a book. Is that the main thing, or are there displays the library sets up to direct readers towards certain topics, or how does that kind of process happen?
Yeah, it's different in every library, different with every librarian, different with every library staff. The library that I'm at now, when we were open, there was a constant display, a permanent display of new books, of course, but then also of new diverse books. So you have the covers all out. You can see they are right here. They're right at the front of the library. This is what is important to us. This is what is important to our community. So they are right there to grab. We also have lots of lists, of course, for whatever. But currently with the libraries being closed, we have switched over to an online readers advisory program, I guess. I don't super know what to call it. It has a name. I can't remember the name right now. So people will fill out a form and say, this is how old my kid is, or I love it when kids fill it out too, because they'll be like, I'm 8. And they ask for the different things that they like. They're like, I like Dog Man, but I also like She-Ra and baking cakes, and I enjoy Asian superheroes, like that kind of broad ask that people have, kids especially. And so then library staff in the libraries and working at home like me, we've been putting together lists of books, and the same as we do when the library is open, we make sure that people understand that there are more books than the classics. Like there are more authors than who you see on the Today Show. There are more authors than what is being pumped at your local book club. There is a large breadth of Minnesotan authors as well that are not just, writing about Sven and Ole, like the Sadiq series by Saman Raleigh. Like those are so freaking popular. I can't keep those in stock anywhere. Kids love those. And it's not just Somali kids. I think that is also another thing that still gets lost in library land and must also in publishing, that books with BIPOC characters aren't just for BIPOC kids, they're for everybody. like my significance as a person, I'm not just here for people exactly like me. I'm here to serve a whole bunch of people. And so there definitely still is a lot of the compartmentalizing of diverse books that can get very frustrating in libraries. And so luckily, the youth services team that I'm on, a lot of them are very open to, making sure, like having that gut check, like, oh, I don't just have to give Curious George to another kid. Like we can mix things up. We can bring in new books. We can bring in new authors. There's nothing, well, there are some things wrong with Curious George, but there is nothing wrong with mixing things up with new authors, new characters. Pull in those Minnesotan authors. Yeah. So sorry, that was a little ranty.
No, that's great. That's great. One thing that just came to mind is I know you're involved in library services at the library. How has that changed during the pandemic, and especially in terms of getting those books to readers with ebooks maybe instead of physical books? Has that been a big change?
Yeah, our ebook circulation bumped way up, as with every library. Luckily, I was able to not steal, but skim off some of the physical book budget when the pandemic first started and we were like for real not open. So my library system, along with a lot of others, have put a lot more money and effort into their ebook collections that reflect some of the needs that haven't been needed before, or were needed on a much smaller scale. And so right now we have much more robust ebook collection. There's a lot more focus on making sure we are getting the books that kids want, but also that educators want. We are working I'm speaking from my experience in my county, but in talking with other librarians around the state, because I'm just nosy, we're all kind of doing the thing where we're like double checking in with our local educators to say like, hey, what's up? How can we make this easier for you? I've got a 5-year-old and like online kindergarten is adorable, but also, there's a lot of stress that these teachers are going through. And so we're trying to do whatever we can to help alleviate some of that.
Cool. Turning over to Duchess next. So I know you've spoken about your books at events and conferences. What kind of feedback have you heard from people like school librarians or even readers about the books that you've been working on?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I love about doing this project is, Arnold, you work with Redline Editorial and you all are responsible for the images. I've gotten so much positive feedback about just the visual aspects of the book. And so much of that is this concept of windows and mirrors, right? So as Tasha is saying that these books aren't just for children of color, right? For white students to look, through a window and see someone who's different from them and learn about them. That's fantastic. But then I also hear from parents that say, oh my gosh, my child is looking into a mirror and seeing someone that looks like them, that is doing something that we didn't know had been done. So the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And I've been fortunate enough to speak about the books at libraries all over the country.
All right. So next I want to kind of do another kind of general question. I think publishers often don't know what questions to ask when it comes to improving the diversity and representation of their books. So I'm curious if any of the panelists here have any thoughts on the simple thing of tell publishers what you think we need to know. Like what's a point or a directive or a note you think that publishers should know, but maybe don't or haven't been asking about?
I guess like you're doing some, but you're not doing enough. Like it sounds harsh, but like don't pat yourself on the back for small gains. These are, I mean, yes, there is progress being made, but not enough. Not enough. Yeah, the bare minimum is not enough. That sounds harsh, but it's true.
I would add that I often hear, and this is in particular a quote that circulated from the buyer at Barnes and Noble, who says Black books don't sell, so they don't stock many, if any. And I think that it's important for publishers to know that young readers, children, teens, and teachers, in my experience, are really hungry for these sorts of books. I think that sometimes librarians and teachers serve as more of a barrier than a gatekeeper because they project their own biases onto readers. The most common one in the library world is this idea that boys don't like to read or that boys won't read about girls. In my experience working with children, I haven't found that to be necessarily true. I think a lot of adults just give boys books about boys, but when I've given boys books featuring female protagonists, featuring girls and women, if the subject matter, if the book is interesting to them, the gender of the protagonist doesn't matter as much. It's the adults, the messages they're getting from adults. And I think we see the same thing with a lot of diverse literature. If there is a white adult standing between the child and the book, what I find adults do, or librarians often do, is try to match books, but by race only, instead of finding out what the child's interests are. There was a library school professor at Wayne State who did an exercise with her students. In a library school class, she sent them all to different public library branches in the area, and they all had to ask the same question, a reader's advisory question, which was, my child just finished Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. What do you recommend next? And without exception, all of the librarians recommended another book by a Black author. It wasn't always a historical novel. The librarians didn't follow up with, well, what specifically do you think your child enjoyed about the book? Was it the family story? Was it the historical element? Was it the kind of sweet? But what they never did, which I found interesting, was never say, well, that's a book in a whole sequence about this same family. Have you read Let the Circle Be Unbroken or Song of the Trees, which actually was a prequel? So it's just interesting. I find a lot of times it feels like librarians have about the same 10 books they recommend over and over again for readers advisory. And I think it's just so important for librarians and teachers to be readers, as well as the person putting books in kids' hands that they think the child will like without doing a whole lot of investigation. So that is my own soapbox I'll get off of. But the point is that children and teens really are hungry for different kinds of books and diversity. And as I said earlier, diversity within the diversity. A lot of Black teens, for example, want to read fantasy and science fiction that feature characters that are like them in terms of being Black, for example. And we're finally starting to see a little more in that area, but there's really not enough.
I really appreciate KT and Tasha's candor because it's affirming for me because I'm new to this world. And so the first time I went to a professional meeting was January 2017. So that's only 3.5 years ago. And I went to the Midwinter ALA in Atlanta. And you all are familiar with this world, and I go to the Atlanta Convention Center, which is huge. And so, as you know, there are thousands of people there. And it was stunning to me, the lack of diversity for such a large crowd, and also the irony of being in Atlanta, which is like a really Black city. And so I didn't even realize what the profession looked like until I, interfaced with the profession. And then about 6 months later in the summer, there was a meeting in Chicago. And I was able to meet with the caucus of the Black librarians. And that was wonderful. I was like, incredibly embraced. It was fantastic. I can also tell you it was not 100 people. And so, there was a lot for me, to learn from that. And so that's just what I will share, because I'm the newbie on this Zoom call. You all have put in far more years than I have.
All right, thanks everybody. So
I'm just a baby librarian.
Well, if you've been a librarian since later than 2017, then you really have more exposure than I do. That's honest to goodness truth.
All right, thanks guys. So with that, we do have some questions in the Q&A box. So I'll kind of go through some of those here in our last 10, 15 minutes or so. So the first one is maybe more of a comment, but I think I heard some things about this earlier from you guys. So I'm curious to get your thoughts. So the comment is that I'm guessing there's a deficit in books about Somali Americans as well as Hmong, another big part of Minnesota culture. I think Tasha, you touched on that a little bit with a particular series, I think it was.
Yeah, Sadiq, Sadiq. I think it's from Capstone. Amazing series. My first library job in 2017 was at the Franklin Library in Minneapolis, which is hands down the best library of all time. And they have the largest American Indian collection there. And they also had the largest Somali language collection in the entire state, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, those collections, as robust as they are being for the biggest, like they definitely need a lot more attention. They need a lot more money put into them. They need a lot more attention given to them. These are communities that are, like this, yes, the Somali population in Minnesota is a little newer, but the Indigenous community has been here. So it is an active suppression of those works and those titles and those authors that is leading to this gap in availability for children or adults. And that suppression is a blight on publishing and also on libraries. Be better. So.
But what we don't need, though, is for white authors to go out and try to fill gaps. So I noticed there was an earlier question about representation related to American Indians or First Nations, Native peoples. And there used to be just a really large number of those, but they were written by white people who weren't even aware that there were different nations. They would just sort of portray what we think of as the Hollywood Indian. We've seen the number of those books go down, which I think is positive, because most white people have no idea what they either present a really romanticized view of Native peoples or just one that, doesn't exist at all, like no tribal affiliation, filled with stereotypes. And we still see some books like that, but they've gone down, and we are beginning to see, I would say in the last 2 years, more authentic literature by Native authors, and particularly some fiction for older kids. I know Harper has a new imprint that's going to be edited by Cynthia Leidick Smith called Heart Drum, that is just books by and about Native peoples, and they're doing both picture books and fiction. I don't know if they're doing nonfiction yet, but I think that Debbie Reese, who is Nambe Pueblo, she has a wonderful website, if you're not familiar with it, called American Indians in children's literature, and she reviews books, and Debbie really tells it like it is from her perspective. And as one of my author friends said, Debbie may hurt your feelings if you're an author by being honest, but one thing you can know about Debbie is she will always tell the truth. And so I think she's had quite a positive impact on books by and about Native Americans as well, as we need diverse books. So those books are out there, but they are about the smallest number when we're looking just at authentic books. There are hopeful signs that this will get better. And I think a lot of it has to do with the education of publishers about, just the fact that there are different nations and they don't necessarily really have a whole lot in common. And so I think that is making a difference.
Another question here from the Q&A box. I'd love to know what the panelists think about how publishers are marketing books by BIPOC authors and illustrators, and if they see ways to improve that marketing.
Put pictures on your books of the authors and illustrators. Put them there, especially for children, because they don't all have phones, luckily, that they can look up an author or illustrator and say like, oh, I'm sorry, does this align with the pictures or the characters that are being represented? Yeah, have those pictures on there. Kids love it if they can flip over to the back and be like, oh, that looks like my auntie. Yeah, so yeah, please, pictures.
I have to say that ABDO's been outstanding about that. So when they offered me the collection, of course, we talked about marketing. And so there were discussions about, using my initials and then my name and then an emblem and all this. And then they said, we want to put your picture in the back of each book. Well, I mean, I'm coming out of an academic tradition where no one would imagine, right? If you wrote a scholarly text, that the person's photo would be in the back. I said, I don't even understand this. And it wasn't until we talked it through that I realized, oh, this is a signifier, right? Because I didn't realize that it would be a signifier. I also originally didn't want to use my name, and I realized that was also another signifier, thinking that people might look up the author's name. And so I have to say they actually had the vision, because that really wasn't on my mind.
Another question from the Q&A box here. It says, thank you so much for saying we don't need white authors to fill the gap. How can white authors ally with authors of color better? In short, what does allyship look like in the publishing world?
Well, my own opinion is they could just take some steps back. They don't need to rush in and try to fill every gap just because there's a market for it. I know that's probably hard for white authors to hear, but they should, I don't know, if they really want to be allies, one way they can do it is just to move back a little and allow some space for BIPOC authors and illustrators to come in to the whole area of children's and teen literature. I think that listening is really important on the part of white people, not just white authors and illustrators, but white people everywhere, listening to what BIPOC people are saying, reading that kind of criticism, like I mentioned on Twitter, and keeping up with blogs and social media that are doing content reviews, and reading the books themselves that are written by BIPOC authors and illustrators. And there are lots of opportunities now. I think SCBWI, the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, is beginning to try to diversify. My wife is a writer, and she just signed up for a conference, a writers conference, children's book writer conference. And she said in the registration, she found it really interesting. The first week of registration was just for BIPOC authors and illustrators. And they didn't open up registration for white authors until the second week, which gave more opportunity. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact that has. But I think the best way to be an ally really is by listening and making space instead of trying to fill those gaps yourself.
All right, well, we're sneaking up on 1 o'clock here. So I'd like to, before we close, give panelists a chance to talk about kind of recent, current, upcoming projects. Anything you'd like to share with the webinar, things you want to let folks know about. Tasha, let's start with you. Any last thoughts on things you got going on?
I will be on a panel on anti-racism in libraries coming up. I think I should know what day it is. I think it's November 19th, but it's called I'm Still Speaking. And so that's coming up soon. You can Google it. Not to like sound rude, but I'm the only Tasha Nins in the world. So if you just I'm Still Speaking, that's the one. And yeah, I don't really have like books or anything. So, like wash your hands and wear your mask, check your battery protector. That's my closing thought.
I can go next. I can say that in my introduction, Arnold talked about that I have some new books coming out, and I just want to share the jacket covers for these books. Given the fact that I do live in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and that Mr. George Floyd was killed, I have ventured on another collaboration with ABDO. Justice for George Floyd is for 4th to 8th graders, and The Killing of George Floyd is for 6th to 12th graders. I am profoundly proud of this work. I'm sad that these books had to be written at all, but I think that they will be important for children to read about and try to understand the tragic events of this summer.
And the only thing I wanted to share is that all of the information I've been talking about with our diversity stats, we have started keeping a database as of 2018 of all the titles that we receive. And we're putting everything in. And we've just been able to make it available with a public interface so people can search themselves for things if they're looking for really specific topics or specific authors or types of authors, subject matters, etc. And it is, and I'm going to put a link in the chat to that, the diversity statistics database. You can crunch the numbers any way you want to. So if you're looking, for example, books about Somali Americans, you can put that in there and see what, if anything, comes up. And as I say, it's just from 2018 to present, but we're continuing to add new books to it as they come in every day. So in a few years, it will be pretty robust in terms of representation from 5 years. If anybody is looking for information prior to that, they can write to the CCBC. And prior to our database, believe it or not, we kept everything as Word documents. And they are further subdivided by categories. So our African-American list includes a breakdown by various African nations, as well as African-Americans within the United States or Afro-Caribbean, just all of the different places around the world that Black people live or have come from. And so we're happy to provide those lists so you can go through them yourself for titles if there's anything specific that you're looking for or researching.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we'll stop it there then. Thank you so much to all the attendees for coming today, and a very special thanks to our panelists. That was a fantastic panel. Thank you so much, you guys, for coming in and being so wonderful. So we'll leave the chat box open for a few more minutes before we close it off. That'll be the end of the presentation. Hope to see everyone at the next MBPR event. Goodbye and have a good afternoon.
Bye.